I'm very pleased to start this next session of our annual conference on migration and the city. Let me first start by saying that we, myself personally, and the CERC in Migration and Integration team are joining from Toronto. That is the traditional land of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississauga Indigenous peoples. And Toronto is also known as the dish with one spoon territory. And I very much like the message of the dish with one spoon, because the dish is the nature, our natural resources, and the spoon is what we each have. So we share in these resources, even though at least myself and all the settlers that came uninvited. But we are taught by the Indigenous peoples that we have to share and take good care of these resources, and that we should come in peace. I also want to say that I'm still struggling with my responsibility and my role in the process, and I acknowledge that I'm a settler. And for me, as a person having lived in Canada for the last 3 years, it is really something that I'm learning about, and I'm still learning, and I think it is very important. I'm also I would like to mention that Ryerson University is in the process of renaming itself. Ryerson comes from the name of Egerton Ryerson, who was, among other things, the architect of the residential schools. The residential schools are the schools where Indigenous children were taken forcibly from their families and were put in those schools. And we know now they suffered abuse and neglect. And actually, we had some tragic, even though long announced discoveries of unmarked graves in spring 2021. Ryerson University was already in the process of coming to terms with its name, but certainly these discoveries of spring 2021 were the last, push for the university to decide to change its name. The process started in late spring 2021, and we hope that it will soon be completed. And there is all the relevant information in our website. So without further ado, and I would like to welcome our panel. We're talking about a topic that I think is distinctively Canadian and distinctively Australian or New Zealand topic in migration, which is how to attract and retain migrants in small and mid-sized cities, and what are the very special dynamics of small and mid-sized cities. And I think that this is a topic close to my heart, and on which we have been doing a lot of work at the CRC. And with that, I would like to introduce our chair and convener of the session, Melissa Kelly, who is a research fellow at the CERC, and who will tell us more about the panel and introduce our speakers. Looking forward.
Great. Thank you so much, Anna. And a warm hello to everyone, and welcome to the 4th session of the Migration and the City Conference. It's a real pleasure and an honor to chair this exciting session entitled Small and Mid-Sized Cities, Urban Policies Targeting Migrants. Most research on migration, diversity, and the city focuses on so-called gateway cities that have historically received large numbers of immigrants. In this session, however, we will turn our focus to small and mid-sized cities, especially those that have become new destinations for international migrants, or that aspire to attract and retain more international migrants in the future. The research that will be presented today is very topical. Many small and mid-sized cities in diverse parts of the world have come to see international migration as a way to compensate for aging populations and high rates of outmigration. International migrants are also seen as a resource that can help to fill labor shortages and revitalize local economies. This has led countries with highly managed migration systems, such as Canada and Australia, to implement policies to encourage migration to small and mid-sized centers. In addition, a range of stakeholders, including local organizations, employers, and community members, have mobilized to welcome migrants to their communities. Despite these efforts, however, many small and mid-sized cities struggle to meet the needs of international migrants, or to retain them over the longer term, raising questions concerning the effectiveness of policies and community-level initiatives targeting migrants. To address this topic, we have 3 wonderful speakers lined up for this session. Martina Boes is a senior lecturer in sociology at Trobe University in Australia. She has researched and written about regional migration and settlement in Australia, employment experiences of temporary migrants and refugees, racialization in employment and migration, and multiculturalism policies. Yolande Pottie-Sherman is an associate professor in geography at Memorial University of Newfoundland and Labrador. She has written on migration and sociocultural diversity and community change. Through her work at Memorial, she co-leads the Adaptive Cities and Engagement Space, a research collective promoting social justice in smaller cities. Finally, Talia Stump is Associate Director of Settlement, Multicultural New South Wales in Australia. She oversees the coordination of migrant and refugee settlement policy on behalf of the Government of New South Wales. She has worked with refugee communities for 15 years through roles in settlement organizations, public policy, and research. So today, each of the speakers will present for about 15 minutes, and we'll start with Martina, who will speak on migrant and refugee settlement in regional Australia. She will be followed by Yolande, who will speak about international migration in context of population aging, population loss, and economic disparity, by way of a comparison between second-tier cities in Atlantic Canada and the US Rust Belt. Finally, we will hear from Talia, who will share insights from North America and Europe on migrant attraction and retention in small cities. After each of our panelists has had the chance to speak, we will have time for discussion and questions. I will be monitoring the chat box, so please type any questions you may have for the speakers there. So without further ado, I will pass things over to Martina.
Thanks, Melissa, and thank you very much to Anna and the whole team at CERC for inviting me along to this exciting conference. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owner of this land from which I'm swimming in today, and that's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I'd like to express my respect for their elders, past and present. And I'd also like to acknowledge that migration research in Australia actually still has a long way to go to engage with settler colonialism and the role of Aboriginal people in our migration research. Now, given the very international audience, I would like to point out that in Australia, we talk about regional towns and regional migration and settlement rather than second and third tier cities. So that's the terminology I will be using in this presentation. In today's presentation, I would like to raise and also seek to address three questions that I think are pertinent to thinking about the future of migration in regional cities and towns as they've emerged in my research that I've been involved in over the last 10, 12 years. And these are, what are the risks of reducing regional migration policies to labour market instruments? What can migrants' experience of regional settlement tell us about the limitations of current policies? And finally, what if successful settlement is not understood as staying in one place, but as an interplay of social and spatial mobility? I'll start by providing an overview of the policy context of regional migration settlement in Australia before introducing migrant and refugee perspectives on their experiences of settling in regional towns. And then I will end by proposing to consider migrant mobilities, social and spatial, in the context of conflicting policy rationales of regional migration. Now, the research which I will draw on is from three distinct research projects in which I've been involved in over the last 12 years. Whilst pursuing slightly different foci, all three projects have dealt with the experiences of people with migrant and refugee backgrounds who have resided or still reside in regional Australia. And all three projects have also examined the perspectives of stakeholders involved with regional migrants and refugees in different capacities, so in local government, in settlement or employment services, ethnic community organisations, education or employment. The data collected in these projects that I will draw upon is a review of migration, multiculturalism and settlement policies, as well as qualitative interviews with regional residents with different migrant and ethnic backgrounds, and also interviews with regional stakeholders who are involved in the governance of regional migration. Each of these three projects has aimed to consider regional migration in its full breadth and therefore investigated a wide range of visa holders. And this is quite different from most research in this area in Australia, which is focused on other refugees or migrants or specific groups of visa holders. Now, let me start with the policy context of regional migration and settlement in Australia. And this is a busy slide, as it is a busy area within which regional migration takes place. So you may already know that Australian migration policy is primarily a federal government domain in terms of the creation of the visa, the design of the visas. The general migration program, as in many other countries, is separate from the humanitarian program. And this goes back to 1993, when it was aimed to provide, and I like to quote that directly to remind us, it was meant to provide a better balance between Australia's international humanitarian objectives and the domestic social and economic goals guiding the annual migration program. And I would suggest that regional migration policies would be an interesting case to actually look at to which extent this balance between the social, economic and the protected humanitarian obligations is still existing today. So to which extent these are balanced. In this table, you can see both regional policies targeted at refugees and asylum seekers in the left table and those targeted at migrants on the right-hand side. Now, the two principal policies that are directed at refugees and asylum seekers are the direct regional settlement of unlinked refugees. So these are aimed at resettling recognised refugees, so with permanent residency and without prior family relations in Australia, in a pre-selected regional town, where they're then provided with settlement services. There's also the Safe Haven Enterprise Visa, or the SHEV visa, which allows asylum seekers who have applied for protection onshore in Australia, which means they don't have access to permanent protection. And they have the right to a pathway to permanent residency if they work or train full-time for 3.5 years within 5 years in a regional town. So again, it's a carrot that is meant at attracting, that is aimed at attracting those groups to regional towns. In addition to these programs directed to refugees and asylum seekers, there's on the right a whole range of visas that are addressed at migrants. Now, there's the points-tested skilled visas. There's a couple of them. There's permanent ones, there's temporary ones, most of which are now employer-sponsored. And there's also the granting of additional points under the skilled migration points test for any skilled migrants who are nominated to live and work in regional Australia. So it is easier to get the visa if you reside in regional Australia. There are also several de facto unskilled or low skilled visas in the green rows, which are based on bilateral agreements, which have been important temporary migration channels of labour into regional areas. So there's 2 working holiday visas, which have provided an important source of fruit picking labour on farms, because people on this visa have access to a 2nd or 3rd year visa if they work for 88 days in a regional location. There's 2 Pacific seasonal labour schemes, which will very shortly be consolidated into one Pacific labour mobility scheme, which have supplemented the working holiday visas through a much more tightly regulated scheme, including more employer obligations and a quasi-sponsorship relationship to the employer. And finally, excuse me, there's a new agricultural visa, the terms of which are currently being defined, but the focus is on attracting temporary labour from Southeast Asian countries. And then in the yellow row at the bottom, you see the visas for graduates from a regional educational institution who are on a temporary visa and who have lived in regional Australia. And again, the rationale is to retain them in the regional location. While there's a lot of detail here, the key takeaway point really is the sheer diversity of government initiatives at the federal level that aim to either attract or retain migrants and refugees in regional areas. What is worth noting about these programs too, on the right, the programs on the right, is that they come with different degrees of dependency on employer sponsors, and thus different and limited scopes for employment mobility and job mobility, and ultimately spatial mobility of these visa holders. A key difference is between, for example, working holiday makers who are free to move between employers and often considered as unreliable by employers, although they dearly miss them, of course, since the onset of the pandemic, and skilled temporary visa holders who are tied to their employer sponsor. They can find another sponsor, but they're more dependent than working holiday visa holders. Pacific Islanders or Palm Scheme participants are the least free to move, and when they do leave their employer, they're considered absconders and are shamed for that in a recent government campaign. Now, another important difference within these schemes on the right is that skilled visa holders can bring their spouse or partner and their children along, and the partner also has work rights, and there are pathways to permanent residency. On the other hand, the visa holders in the green rows do not enjoy these rights and pathways. So all in all, these policies create an internally differentiated pool of regional residents with different rights and different vulnerabilities. Now, in addition to these migration policies at the federal level, there are also several policies at different government levels that also shape regional migration and settlement experiences of migrants and refugees. At the federal government level, there are, for example, federally funded refugee settlement policies and services in blue. There are also employment regulations and policies related to the enforcement of labour law in sectors that are dominated by migrant workers, such as the horticulture sector, which is highly relevant and often very contentious, such as recently decisions on the on the minimum hourly wage and piece rates in the horticulture sector. There's at the local level and partly the state level, increasingly multicultural and intercultural policies. There have also been some skilled regional migration policies at state level. And beyond the earlier mentioned federal government directed resettlement of unlinked refugees and chef visas, there's also another increasingly important channel of regional migration and settlement for refugees, which is the assisted relocation of refugees from metro to regional areas. Now, such initiatives have occurred since more than 10 years in specific regional towns. They come in different shapes, such as collaborations between metro-based service providers and regionally based stakeholders, such as employers or labour hire providers. They've at times also involved local governments in the region. Now, at the bottom of this slide, you see a busy base, which is made up of employers, community sector organisations and service providers, metro and regionally based, who are important players in these relocation initiatives. And they are, of course, also the actors that are involved in the everyday governance of regional migration and settlement of all of these different groups listed on the previous slide below. And I should mention that beside all this governance of regional migration, there's also, of course, self-initiated relocation to regional towns by former refugees who live in metro areas and seek better job opportunities, more affordable housing, or a more suitable lifestyle for the children away from the city. Now I'm turning to perspectives of refugees and migrants now, and I keep to this dichotomy because this is how policy sees them, but I'm aware that this is all the contested dichotomy. The key challenges experienced by these different groups across the different research projects were really on the side of refugees, blocked employment pathways, underemployment, racism, discrimination, limited English language class offerings as part of the settlement services, and a shortage of higher education and training opportunities. On the side of skilled visa holders, typical challenges include career interruptions and underemployment, lacking access to employment services for secondary applicants, as well as mobility compromises due to the visa and the dependency on the employer sponsor. For all other labour migrants, the prime risk is really the risk of exploitation, which is sector specific, so not as such related to only the visa. Now here are a couple of quotes from interviews with a skilled visa holder on the left and a service provider working with refugees on the right, just to present some of these voices here, which highlight some of these challenges. The key point here is really that there's a lot of skills wastage and a lot of loss of opportunity, not just for Australia as a host community and host economy, but also disappointment over blocked employment pathways and often precarity in the labour market that indicate the need to review the policies that jointly produce these challenges. Now, the third point that I would like to make here is that the different experiences of living in a regional town, both in the workplace, but also in the broader community, in schools, community spaces, etc., are navigated by migrants in the context of the earlier mentioned policies and in the context of their overall lives and the households, really. Following on from the earlier mentioned challenges, it is not surprising that many regional residents with migration and refugee backgrounds decide to move on to larger metropolitan centres. Underlying this so-called secondary migration is typically either employment and educational aspirations or pre-existing family and community connections, both of which are key to successful settlement, one can argue. However, not all of those who experience challenges do move on. Picking apart these factors in our last project on social and spatial mobilities, so picking apart the factors that underpin the cases of staying put despite challenges, We saw that people remain in the regional town, not simply because of the benefits they enjoy, such as a quieter lifestyle or a safe environment for their kids, but many people remain despite the challenges that they experience, while others move on to other places. So looking at the reasons for people to stay despite these challenges, in finding meaningful work, in finding skills matching employment or employment at all, we found that these were situated in a range of domains. Typically, visa regulations are an important domain. So I've already referred to the employer dependency. Skilled visa holders who cannot find a job despite a skills shortage, but they're tied to the regional area because of their visa, they will stay. Working holiday visa holders stay because they want access to a second visa or a third-year visa if they manage to collect the 88 days on a farm. Family contexts and the gender division of labour and households matter, and gender expectations of who moves elsewhere and under which circumstances are another important domain where this agency is shaped. And the third important domain is community and existing co-ethnic or shared faith communities. And yeah, so exactly, especially co-ethnic and shared faith communities are mentioned here. Welcoming communities are often elicited as a reason to stay, but I'd really like to highlight that this should not be confused with the provision of multicultural festivals, of which there are increasingly, they increasingly exist in regional occasions, but rather the sense of feeling at home and being accepted, having a friendly neighbour, or a church community that they feel part of. Finally, what also emerged in our research is the power of resignation and lacking hope in making migrants stay in regional towns despite experiencing challenges in realizing the life that they had sought for themselves or their family. Now, I hope I'm going good for time. I can't see the chat. So going back to my initial questions, I'd like to end with the following takeaway points. Regional migration, understood as a short-term labour supply policy, especially for horticulture, has ultimately led to competition between different visa holders with varying restrictions and poor employment conditions in some regional labour markets. And yet the area of visa that contributes to these layers of vulnerability still keeps growing, as we see with the new agriculture visa. Skilled migrants' dependencies on employer sponsors are often accompanied by significant compromises, careers, employment conditions within families. Regional refugee settlement and regional relocation initiatives cannot replace support for long-term skills development and employment pathway support. And I'd like to add here, beyond local multi and intercultural policies. Overall, what has emerged then in our research is that there's often a tension between the policy rationales of short-term labour supply that underpins migration policies and the long-term investment in connections between existing and newly arriving community members that underpins largely multi and intercultural policies. Put simply, there's as yet insufficient coordination between economic and social goals and impacts of regional migration policies at different government levels. Finally, migrants and refugees staying in a regional town should not be mistaken as a sign of successful settlement as in retention. If successful settlement is the aim of regional migration and settlement policies, then secondary migration presents a path of rather than a failure of regional settlement and will need to be considered and planned for better at different government levels. And I'll stop here and thank you for your attention.
Thanks so much, Martina. According to my clock, you were right on time, so I appreciate that. I thought this was a really informative presentation that raised a number of important questions and some really innovative ideas. So I look forward to the discussion so that we can get into some of those in more detail. Thanks again. So Yolande, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Melissa, for the introduction. So I am an urban geographer, and my research focuses on local responses to immigration, particularly in second-tier cities in the United States Rust Belt and Atlantic Canada. One of the big questions of my research concerns what immigration settlement experiences are like in places like the one that I live in currently, St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador in Canada, or the one that I grew up in Syracuse, New York. An essential argument of my work over the last 5 years is that we have to pay more attention to places with relatively small immigrant populations, but where local actors increasingly frame international migration as a source of resilience against demographic aging, population loss, or economic crisis. We know, as Melissa mentioned in her introduction, that migration is commonly associated with larger cities and major immigrant gateways. And on the other hand, there's also been a lot of interest in places which experience rapid new influxes, known as new immigrant destinations. So I'm thinking about Jamie Winder's work, for example. But there's been generally less interest in low migration second-tier cities. And in terms of a conceptual framework, I'm inspired by ongoing discussions about the diversity of migration destinations, which we heard in yesterday's session. And I like how Pisareskaya and colleagues recently put this when they say that there is a diversity of urban diversities. What lies beyond the major immigrant gateways is not just about adding more case studies, but it's also about questioning how and from where we make theory about migration experiences. I'm approaching these questions from the perspective of cities in the Rust Belt and Atlantic Canada, which I think offer fruitful grounds for comparison because they both have experienced long-standing demographic and economic crises. In this presentation, I'm drawing on two research projects involving fieldwork, including participant observation, interviews, and media and document analysis in the two regions. So I'll provide an overview of some of the themes of these two case studies before providing concluding discussion. In 2015, I started to research urban responses to immigration in the US Rust Belt. The goal of my research initially was to investigate the string of pro-immigration responses that emerged across this region after the 2007-2008 financial crisis, some of which you see in this timeline. I found these responses really interesting because they were happening also in cities with very small immigrant populations. Cincinnati, Dayton, Toledo, and Cleveland, around 5% or a little bit more of the population or a little bit less is foreign born, or places like Detroit, which are former immigrant gateways. So this was really another set of local responses to immigration that was led by a consortium called the Welcoming Economies Global Network, or We Global, whose mission is to encourage Rust Belt cities to, quote, embrace immigrants as a means of revitalizing urban neighborhoods and spurring local economic growth. And as part of this project, I observed 2 We Global convenings and interviewed the leaders of welcoming initiatives in Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, Cleveland, Dayton, Louisville, Toledo, St. Louis, Detroit, and Buffalo. And through these interviews, it became clear that this was a rebranding effort to shift the perceptions of the Rust Belt towards a diverse global region worthy of investment, and that policy framings of migration were deeply connected to narratives of loss. For example, as one welcoming initiative leader told me, we'll keep declining if we're not welcoming. And another explained that without immigrants, we'll be left behind again. So through these interviews, it also became clear that new initiatives commonly positioned immigrants and refugees as solutions to systemic issues facing Rust Belt cities, including outmigration, population decline, and property abandonment. This movement could be understood through a lens of austerity urbanism, thinking about Jamie Peck's work, as welcoming efforts aligned with the needs of cities under extreme economy. For example, a unique housing model emerged in a series of Rust Belt cities, including Cleveland, Toledo, and Detroit, to match refugees with abandoned homes acquired by land banks, which are organizations set up to strategically reclaim such properties. These initiatives reflected the strategic alignment of social justice and humanitarian movements supporting refugee resettlement with local growth coalitions. And this alignment is illustrated through this statement by a representative of the Discovering Home program in Cleveland, which is a partnership between the land bank, and refugee service providers to rehab vacant homes for refugees. As this person explains, at the land bank, our primary goal is to create a situation where we can get property back into productive use. And the refugee service providers, their goal is to create productive citizens. And we felt with the marriage of those two interests, we could only have success. This is an alignment I examined in a 2018 article in Urban Geography. So first of all, we see a major emphasis on refugees and former refugees within this movement, owing to the role of refugee resettlement as a significant dimension of urban change in many Rust Belt cities. And also these interviews I did made clear that another set of practices was emerging around the recruitment of international students in the Rust Belt as potential skilled workers. For example, local initiatives like Global Cleveland You see some of their information on the screen. We're promoting a stepping stone strategy for international students as a way to keep them in the local labor market post-graduation. This strategy involved looking for workarounds in the immigration system and demystifying visa options for international students. So I interviewed international students and former students in the Cleveland area who were trying to stay in the United States after graduating via the H-1B visa lottery, but who, as I found out, were encountering numerous challenges, from the exclusionary policies of the Trump administration to local small and mid-sized employers in the Cleveland area who had limited capacity to engage with the immigration system or who had limited will to sponsor these students in the H-1B visa lottery. And ultimately, this Rust Belt case study challenged the narrative of this region as one associated with loss, including of industry, population, and status. And as I've argued in Geography Compass, the realities of international migration in the Rust Belt are far richer and more complex, including around refugee resettlement and the internationalization of higher education. So turning to the second case study, the Atlantic Canadian findings are drawn from participant observation at a series of immigration consultations and meetings held in the region from 2015 to 2019. I'm also drawing on a series of interviews with NGOs, government and private sector actors, including with local immigration partnership representatives in 7 locations: Charlottetown, Fredericton, Moncton, Halifax, Sydney, St. John, and St. John's, as well as interviews with immigrant entrepreneurs and international students in St. John's, which were conducted with one of my co-authors, Nelson Graham. The interviews we conducted show some clear parallels with the Rust Belt. Policy framings of immigration are similarly intertwined with narratives of population loss and demographic aging. As one key informant noted, there's a real sense that we need to save our communities. We need to save our schools, hospital closures. This is all of what's at risk if immigration is not increased. Local actors emphasize welcoming as a population growth and economic diversification strategy, encouraging newcomers to, quote, live, work, and stay, as the mayor of St. John's said, addressing the crowd at the Atlantic Immigration Summit of 2019. From a conceptual perspective, while pro-immigration activism in the Rust Belt can be understood as a rescaling strategy in the face of deindustrialization and globalization, I'm thinking of Saglar and Glick-Schiller's work, that explanation doesn't neatly apply to Atlantic Canada, which has a different history of core periphery dynamics. But what has always struck me about these regions is that neither fits neatly into the category of a new immigrant destination. For one, they're not really new destinations as they have settler colonial histories. They're not really experiencing rapid change. Immigration really has a big presence in public discourse, in contrast to new immigrant destinations where population flows are a surprise, and they're not reacting to new populations, but proactively recruiting newcomers. As one participant told me, we need these people. Here's a map of Atlantic cities above 10,000 in population, so larger bubbles are bigger population centers, and the change in immigrant population between 2006 and 2016. The darker bubbles signal more change. Some places really have experienced no change or negative change, whereas according to some definitions of a new immigrant destination, we would expect to see a change of 100% or more. Charlottetown is really the closest that we get to rapid change. And of course, it's going to be interesting to see the new census numbers for 2021. And so to think about all of this, Nelson Graham and I introduced the concept of aspiring gateways to capture what we see here. While relatively isolated from international migration flows, aspiring gateways adopt forward-looking initiatives to increase immigration for demographic or economic purposes. Economics are a driving rationale, but many local actors recognize that that is not enough, that sphere is simply not sufficient, and other spheres of retention are important. Of course, this research also highlighted some really important key differences, namely the wide divergence of the Rust Belt in Atlantic Canada in terms of the United States and Canada's immigration federalism and cooperation between different levels of government. So a central theme of my interviews with local immigration partnership representatives concerned the importance of intergovernmental collaboration, namely via the provincial nominee programs, the LIPs, consistent messaging about benefits of immigration at all levels of government across multi-sectoral networks, the private sector, and higher education. And international student retention provides a strong example of this collaboration, evidenced by a new provincial nominee stream, specifically recruiting international graduate student entrepreneurs in Newfoundland and Labrador. And the interviews that Nelson Graham and I have conducted with international students who are founding startups in St. John's, Newfoundland, really show a clear relationship between immigration, higher education, and an emerging entrepreneurial ecosystem here. It's really important to note that such place-based visas are the envy of many US immigration reformers. For example, in 2020, Senator Pete Buttigieg included a community renewal visa in his platform for the Democratic nomination. Similar narratives are found in the proposal for the Heartland visa, which was proposed by the Economic Innovation Group in 2019 and also endorsed by the Great Lakes Metro Chambers Coalition. Notably, the Heartland visa report references Atlantic Canada as an immigration model for struggling US communities, including in the Rust Belt. Whoops, sorry. So to wrap up here, this project is about looking to the margins. When we do that, we see things that challenge conventional ways of thinking, such as about new immigrant destinations versus major established destinations. There are common threads between the two regions: policy framings of international migration around population loss, economic decline and population shrinking, and the embrace of forward-looking proactive initiatives, which has led my collaborator and I to frame these places as aspiring gateways. The major tension that emerges from this comparison is around aspiring gateways as potential sources of inspiration versus the risks involved with instrumentalized welcoming, where the warmth of welcome hinges on the ability of newcomers to reverse structural problems. This can also mean chasing new populations at the expense of enhancing the quality of life of existing communities. But we shouldn't discount aspiring gateways as purely entrepreneurial. They are also places where how best to welcome and retain newcomers is a guiding and extremely pressing question for local actors. So with that, I will conclude. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Yolande. Another perfectly timed presentation. I thought it was really rich, and it's great that you're doing comparative work on Canada and the United States on this topic, because there isn't a whole lot out there. So I look forward to following your work in the years to come. All right, over to Talia, please.
Hi, everyone. I'd like to start by acknowledging I'm joining you from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation in Sydney, Australia, and pay my respect to their elders past, present, and emerging. I'm going to start my presentation by taking you back to 2017, where one morning in a small Australian country town, two local men were sitting in a cafe discussing a news story they'd seen on the war in Iraq the previous night. The men felt so moved by what they'd seen that they started thinking about what they might be able to do locally to help out. They lived in Walla Walla, about 5.5 hours drive south of Sydney, and around 700 people. They happened to be the owners of the two largest businesses in town, manufacturers of grain silos and sheds, and had been struggling to find workers for a number of roles. The town needed people. So the men conjured up an idea to try and bring refugees to their town, focusing on people who had already arrived and were living in Australia. They took the idea to their local community development committee and were given the green light to move forward with developing a strategy. In my role working for the New South Wales government, I'd already been working alongside a number of regional communities who were keen to grow their population through migration. Walla Walla came to us and immediately stood out. They wanted to take their time and carefully plan their approach. They were clear that if this were to work, it needed to be led by the community and they needed to get everyone on board. So they came to us asking for practical advice and guidance. And one of their first questions was, can you point us in the direction of other towns who've done this before that we can learn from? And in 2019, thanks to a Churchill Fellowship and inspired by Walla Walla's vision, I set out overseas to learn from the experiences of other regional towns who've implemented their own migrant attraction and retention strategies. I visited 20 small and mid-sized cities in Canada, the USA, Germany, Norway, and Sweden, and met with representatives from volunteer groups, government, services, employers, and migrants themselves. In each of the places I visited, one key point kept coming home to me: the importance of different sectors of the community all working together, not only in efforts to attract migrants, but to make sure they feel welcome and included so that they choose to stay. It's true that newcomer attraction and retention is often initiated by one section of the community: a refugee volunteer group, a local employer, a council. So the question for me was, how have communities managed to grow these efforts into a whole of community approach? Today, I'm going to take you to the USA and Norway to look at this question. But first, I'm going to show a video I've put together, which allows some of the inspiring people I met along the way to share with you some insights in their own words.
What we have decided here is that we see all the newcomers as an asset. We need more people here in this area. The companies need more labor. So this is a good thing for us. This is not a burden or something, this is a resource for us. And when you decide that as a municipality, that helps you to go on and create a good system for those persons. So
I think to succeed, I think it's very important that the society want them to come because we need them. Not only to help, to be kind, but because we need them. And if we need them, it's much easier to have them included than if we don't need them.
Yeah, in a small town, I like it very much when I compare with the big towns, for example, Stockholm. In small towns, just I can contact with the people easily, and and we share our experience easily.
Aber ich war dann überrascht, wie viele positiv eingestellt waren und sich engagiert haben. Und ich würde sagen, keine Angst haben. Es gibt viele Leute, die helfen wollen. Die Helfer sind auch nie alleine.
We have new residents in Missoula who are here by choice, not by chance. They're grateful for the opportunity to be in our community. They go to work immediately. They begin to adjust to culture and values here, which aren't that different from culture and values that they bring with them, right?
And every time I talk to people and I tell them that I live in the refugee camp and now I'm here finishing my master's degree in public administration, having a business that employs 32 people, you know, perspective changes. And that changed a lot of people's mind. You know, it changed a lot of people's mind. People that never had opportunity to really talk to us and hear our story, and now hearing our story. For them, instead of them hearing from the media, which usually, you know, gives a bad, negative perspective, negative narrative about us, now we're telling our own narrative, and that helped the Somali communities and the communities that lived here before get to know each other better and accept each other.
One of the keys is to check your assumptions at the door. In terms of both what you think you know about the person who's coming, because you're probably wrong. They are an individual person like everyone else, and they're all different. And the other thing is to check your assumptions as to about what you think they might need, and without asking them. And also don't assume that they know all the little things about how to function in your world that you know. So ask lots of questions.
One of my early stops was the university town of Missoula in Montana. Missoula has a population of around 70,000, and aside from Hmong refugees who were resettled there in the 70s, they really hadn't seen a lot of new migrants in recent years. Actually, Montana was one of only 2 states in the US that weren't participating in the refugee resettlement program. Back in 2015, after seeing the shocking image of baby Yolande's body washed up on a European shore, a group of local mums got together and came up with a plan to get Missoula approved by government as a refugee resettlement city. They secured such broad community support that by the time I visited a few years later, over 300 refugees had arrived, mostly from Eritrea and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. In Missoula, they worked hard to build community consensus. There was plenty of hesitation from local residents when the idea was first raised. And on top of this, a lot of noise was created by people from conservative surrounding towns who came into Missoula to stage a number of protests. With the support and leadership of the mayor, over a couple of years, advocates went out to different pockets of the community to hold information sessions and conversations, universities, schools, business chambers, services, and they talked through, this is what it would mean for us, and here's what the benefits could look like socially, economically, culturally for our community. Local advocates shared with me just how important these conversations were as a way to unpack and work through community fears and concerns. This gave locals a chance to be part of the process from early on, rather than feel as if it was something happening to them, which they had no say in. It was also useful in identifying potential risks and issues that could be considered in the planning process. As more segments of the community became involved, they started to think about how they could contribute once their new neighbours arrived, like the manager of the Holiday Inn, who'd been very vocally supportive in the media and amongst the business community. He saw an opportunity to help address a chronic shortage of hotel cleaners and established a cleaning employment program which trained up new arrivals and offered them work in a team with others that spoke the same language. You can see here a photo of a notice board in a local community organisation, Soft Landing Missoula, that I visited, which provides a space where local residents can offer donated services and goods. Everything from a certified lactation counsellor to free guitar lessons. Missoula's whole of community approach helped move the strategy beyond just a warm welcome to a coalition of individuals, organisations and businesses that could be mobilised to work alongside the government-funded settlement service provider once the refugees arrived. I'm now going to take you to a very beautiful and remote part of the world, to Nordland County, which is north of the Arctic Circle in Norway. I visited Nordland as I was interested to learn about the in-migration project, an ambitious strategy to attract 10,000 residents within 5 years. Back in 2013, when the project launched, Nordland County government and its 44 municipalities were growing more and more concerned about their economic and social sustainability. There was plenty of work. The region is most well known for its cod fishing, and there's also a growing tourism industry, but just not enough people to do it. Most Norwegians aren't keen on the low-skilled nature of the work, and the fact that it's seasonal also made it difficult to find workers. So the businesses there had come to rely on fly-in, fly-out workers, mostly from Eastern Europe, who would do the jobs, but then fly back to their home countries and of course take their money with them. For many of the municipalities, and especially some of the really small ones with under 5,000 people, the idea of trying to attract immigrants as a strategy was not something that was front of mind or that they had the resources to be able to pursue. So the county government initiated a region-wide project and 7 municipalities decided to get involved. The aim was to promote Nordland as an attractive place to live and also work to improve conditions for newcomers by focusing on their settlement needs. The county employed a project coordinator and offered funding, and in return, municipalities needed to identify a staff member who could lead the project locally. By 2018, while they weren't quite able to reach their target, Nordland had managed to stem their decline and add an additional 6,300 long-term immigrants to the region. A key ingredient of Nordland's success was the governance and coordination mechanisms they put in place. Through the coordination of the county, participating municipalities formed a network which met regularly and helped to facilitate collaboration and mentoring across the region. This regional approach led to innovative solutions for big challenges. The issue of seasonal work had long been a barrier for people deciding to relocate to Nordland. So employers from the cod fishing industry in one municipality got together with employers from the tourism industry in another and packaged up year-round employment, which could be offered to people. The collaboration between the county and then the local coordinators in the municipalities helped bring on board a range of relevant partners from different sectors, including national government agencies, research institutions, big corporate sponsors, and right down to local volunteer groups. For many municipalities, what started out as a project that was focused on employment and promotion actually ended up being one which was all about social inclusion and connectedness. And this was something that really took the people I spoke to by surprise. For example, the very small community of Flagstad with only 1,200 people. They started out by talking to the fly-in, fly-out workers who were already there. Many of the workers had been coming and going for years now. So they asked, what would it take to get you to stay? They were expecting them to say that they needed help learning how to speak Norwegian. But actually what they heard was that most of them felt isolated and lonely. They'd go to work each day and then come back to their accommodation, which was supplied by their employer, and have little contact with the rest of the community. So the municipality created a project which established a meeting space in the centre of town where locals and migrants could interact and put on regular events to encourage people to get together. Aside from the increase in population, an important outcome of this project has been taking the migrant attraction conversation from one which is happening at federal and county levels of government to one that is carried and owned by local communities. This community ownership has been vital in the continuity of efforts beyond the end of the formal 5-year program. And now here I am, back in New South Wales, working in government to implement what I learnt. Offering up the driver's seat to communities isn't necessarily something government is well known for. But what Missoula, Norland, and many of the places I visited showed me is that for migrant attraction to be successful, we have to get as many sectors of the community behind it as possible. We have recently launched a 3-year pilot program, New South Wales Grow, which is helping establish multi-sectoral partnerships of local stakeholders at a regional level to plan and implement a newcomer attraction and retention strategy. As the government funder, our role is helping shape the mandate and provide the resources for community, government, and business to come together at a local level and set their own direction. As partner, we are contributing to planning, identifying opportunities, and helping to work through systemic challenges, connecting in the relevant parts of government where it's needed. Walla Walla continue their efforts and have inspired many other towns across the region to initiate their own strategies. They are a member of our Grow partnership and are collaborating with others across their region to strengthen their approach. Since their initial idea, they formed a refugee resettlement committee and spent a lot of time talking to the local community through open door community meetings and even door knocking. They set up a number of working groups to map out jobs, housing and supports, and have been working with an Assyrian community organisation in Sydney to promote their town to people interested to relocate. And you can see here a photo from a bus tour where prospective new residents were meeting with a local employer in Walla Walla. So far, one family has relocated and is settling in well. And while this may not seem like much, one family in a town of 700 has been a big deal. And as word has travelled back to Sydney, a number of other families are now considering making the move. The small cities most successful at attracting and retaining migrants have a strong sense that it is the right thing to do for the economic and social sustainability of their city. And when the whole community is rolling out the welcome mat, this helps migrants feel like they belong. Thank you.
Thanks, Talia. That was great. Compared to the other 2 presentations, you offered a different perspective by really focusing on the community level. So that was excellent. And I really appreciate how you've identified some key things that communities can do to more effectively attract and retain migrants. I should add that I also think it's really impressive that your work has spanned so many cities and has crossed 5 different countries on 2 continents. So congratulations on that. All right, so we will move now to the Q&A period. And I see the chat box is very active and we have some questions coming in here. I'll start with one that's for all 3 of you from Dan Hebert. Throughout the presentations, there has been a lot of focus on top-down approaches to attraction and retention of newcomers to non-metropolitan places. Can you say more about bottom-up approaches and what that adds to the process? So maybe we can start with Martina.
Yeah, thanks. It's a really good question. And I have to say that in the research that I've conducted, there was more focus on what happens as a consequence of these policies at the kind of local, state and federal government level. What I'd like to I mention here as a very bottom-up initiative actually relates to the labour market, so the horticultural labour market. And it is an initiative that I've just recently come across, and we invited the person who invented that initiative to speak at a recent symposium. So it's an app really for mobile workers. So it's a kind of what he refers to as a backpacker app. And the idea is really to build on all the knowledge that is there on the exploitation of workers, of mobile migrant workers, and say, well, we take this in our hands and we don't rely on the federal government organized harvest trial and the state government initiatives for harvesting workers, but we build our own security net. And I think I would count that as one of these bottom-up initiatives, because I mean, it's probably come out from my presentation that I really think a lot of the problems are structural and they cannot be solved by small initiatives without tackling also the bigger picture of exploitation in particular employment sectors that are dominated by migrants. So for me, that was a really good example of someone who works in a sector who knows about the plight of other migrant workers and devises this app that really helps people to find a good employer, a fair employer, and share experiences and knowledge. Maybe I'll stop there.
Thanks, Martina. Maybe we can go to Yolande.
Yeah, thanks, Dan, for your question. I was thinking about this in terms of, bottom-up approaches in St. John's. There was a local organization here that worked, really exclusively from the bottom up, specifically to serve people who were underserved by the local resettlement agency. So that organization was, built from the ground up to try to help people who were like the spouses of international students or who were temporary workers who weren't necessarily being served by other programs. And, one of the key challenges with that, even though they did amazing work, is that they just ultimately folded because of the inability to secure funding, because of the perception that they were duplicating the efforts of the local refugee service provider. So I think, that raises the point about needing to also have buy-in from other levels of government. And a similar kind of example I can think about in the Rust Belt case is the case of the International Village project in Cleveland. So that's a project that really, refugee service providers who have been doing this resettlement work for a long time. I mean, I would consider that to be somewhat ground up. It depends on how you look at it. Have, tried to partner with developers, with contractors, with the local land bank to revitalize one section of Cleveland on the near west side, but have come into lots of tension with the city government, and the city government hasn't necessarily bought into the project. So I think maybe the lesson learned really is the importance of collaboration across, not that there aren't bottom-up initiatives happening, but that they need to solicit endorsement from other actors.
Thank you. And Talia.
Yeah, the term bottom up, it's a bit of a buzzword, I have to say, and especially in government, we like to throw it around a lot. And yeah, it's become a bit of a pet hate of mine, because I think we really need to unpack what we mean by bottom up, and that involves an analysis of the power dynamics that we're working within in terms of government's role, and whether that be in my position at the state level of government, federal level, and then of course we've got local government representing local communities. But I think in terms of my the work that I've been doing and that really stood out to me through the research is the importance of local communities really owning and taking the time to undertake the planning process. The investment in a community-led process where different players from different parts of the community, and that should include local government, but also community groups, business, services, coming together to think through what do we have to offer as a community? What are our existing assets? What are the unique points that we have to that set us apart that we can use not only to try and put ourselves out there as an attractive destination for new residents, but also that are going to sort of be in place to support people and welcome people once they arrive. But then through that process to really get clear on, okay, where are our gaps and where are the things that we're going to potentially need some work around. And that's where if there's some investment, and I guess the role that we're trying to play at the moment through our pilot project and the other work we've been doing in New South Wales government is to invest in assisting communities to undertake that planning process, and then as government be there to help resource and connect in to help plug the gaps, so to support communities and work alongside of them to address all of the elements that need to be considered. And the interesting thing I think I picked up also from Martina and Yolande's presentations is this idea of the snowball effect. We've certainly noticed it with the regional communities we've worked with here, that when one community like Walla Walla gets started and gets a bit of traction and builds that community support, we start to see other surrounding towns also become interested, and it generates naturally this sort of community-led process where you have the local communities coming forward, and whether that be to government or whether that be going directly to approach potential cohorts of people interested to relocate, that that also has been a great way to sort of generate some momentum around the community-led planning process.
Great, thank you, Talia. This is a question for Martina, but perhaps our other two speakers would also like to chime in. What factors of a welcoming community contribute to people staying in regional areas, especially since there exists a welcoming city standard in Australia for cultural diversity and inclusion policy and practice?
Yes, it's a good question, and I should point out that the Welcoming Cities Initiative arrived in Australia just at the end of our first large regional project, and it was interesting that Bendigo was that first city that achieved that standard after there's a lot of anti-mosque Islamophobia in the town that really rallied opponents to a new mosque from everywhere in Australia. So what I would say to that is that what individual migrants and refugees we spoke to pointed out was not the city-led multicultural festival. So that probably came out before. It was more the kind of everyday relationships with neighbours. It was the relationships in the workplace to an employer who was welcoming beyond being an employer, but also invited the workers along to a Christmas celebration. Or it was the volunteers who helped offering driving lessons, for example. And I'm aware that saying this in this panel, well, there's all these fantastic initiatives at the local government level. I wouldn't want to critique what local government is doing. I'm just, what really came out of our conversations with migrants was that they were often unaware of what local government initiated, and it was more really this kind of the relations in the workplace, the relations to the neighbours, the relations in the faith community, and they were at times quite ironic or cynical about the more celebratory aspects of local multiculturalism. So, for example, there was a fantastic initiative called Multicultural Ambassadors. It was then renamed into Intercultural Ambassadors, and the people who happened to be in touch with these intercultural ambassadors were very were praising this initiative, but lots of people in the same town were completely unaware. So I think there's a bit of a parallel world of what's happening at this kind of local government-led public space, and what happens in families where, say, a woman with children is not even able to leave the house and to make it to any of these events. Yeah. So not to denigrate welcoming cities, but I do think that we need to be careful about stopping there and seeing the accreditation as a welcoming city as the answer to the problems that exist in the labour market and in other spaces.
Thanks, Martina. Talia, would you like to jump in on that one?
Yeah, we're actually working closely with welcoming cities in Australia to roll out our pilot program, and they're working alongside each of the participating local governments in our pilot to help them undertake some research and consultation at a local level to inform the strategic planning process. So they do some amazing work. I think I totally agree with what Martina has said around the importance of building social connectedness and social inclusion as a key factor for migrants feeling that sense of local belonging. I think it's something that I've seen through my research, but also the work we've been doing here. And an argument that I have to, if I'm honest, make regularly within government in terms of linking the importance of investing in social inclusion activities to conversations and discussions around regional economic development. I think there's a tendency, and it's the bread and butter of the agency I work for. We really work closely in partnership with community around building welcoming communities. But in talking and getting the buy-in from other parts of government, which are really necessary to have around the table in this conversation, I think it's a conversation I've had to have regularly. And so that investment and the opportunities for connections to form locally between the broader community and newcomers is really critical.
Thank you. Yolande?
No, it's okay. I don't need to comment on this question. Thank you.
Okay, well, I actually have a question for you. Could you say a little bit more about how Canadian and American approaches to welcoming immigrants differ at the federal level? We have a number of Australians in the audience today, so I'm sure they would like to hear a little bit more about that. And secondly, what do you think the federal governments of the two countries could learn from one another when it comes to creating effective immigration policies that benefit small and mid-sized communities that are eager to attract and retain migrants?
Okay, I might have to ask you about the second question again, because I was already writing notes about your first question. But just to say, yeah, I think, what I've learned from my research is, in the United States, really the absence of a federal integration strategy. And what that has meant is you have organizations like Welcoming America. I think someone was mentioning that organization in the chat. I think it's a really interesting development because that's a national nonprofit organization that has kind of built a network around community-driven immigrant integration. And in fact, if you look at Canada, the Canadian federal approach has evolved to kind of put more emphasis on the local level through local immigration partnerships, or LIPs, which are local but federally funded, and they have a set of prescribed steps and goals and evaluation mechanisms. There are a lot of similarities between certified welcoming cities in the United States and cities with local immigration partnerships. The kind of process, looks very similar. The goals kind of look very similar. In some ways, Welcoming America, that model requires even more buy-in by the city. So they require that a full-time staff person be dedicated to immigrant integration. Whereas, for example, in where I live, St. John's, our local immigration partnership has a director, which is part-time, right? So I think we have, there's major obvious kind of national, who are we belonging differences, but then also in the kind of the actual mechanisms of how this work, there are a lot of similarities. And I'm sorry, I can't remember your second question. There's so much going on in the chat, and there's private messages and it's sensory overload.
The second part was, what do you think the federal governments of the two countries could learn from one another?
Oh, that's a really hard question. Maybe, maybe I could kind of approach that as more of like from a regional level, because I think what I've been thinking a lot about is how, like what can the Rust Belt learn from Atlantic Canada? Some of these discourses are really all about like, maybe we can learn and we can they really want to have provincial nominee programs, or they really want to have the ability to fine tune and be so boutique about their immigration selection that they can recruit international graduate student entrepreneurs and startup owners. So what do we learn from Atlantic Canada? If we're in the Rust Belt, will we learn, like we have like all of the programs, we're doing like all of the things, we have all of the control, or not all of the control, but we have a lot of control to be so specific, and yet we still have really serious retention challenges. The Rust Belt, some of those Heartland visa proposals, they look at Atlantic Canada and they say, look, the retention rates of 50%, that's great, right? Whereas when we look at those numbers, we're like, what are we doing wrong? So I think, I think that's like, that has to be tempered, and that's where we kind of need to remember to look at different spheres of influence. And then on the reverse, we look at Atlantic Canada and what can Atlantic Canada learn from the Rust Belt. And I've been kind of trying to think more about that. And that's something I want to consider more in my paper. Thanks, Melissa.
Thank you. This is a question from Michelle Wynn to all of the speakers. Has the pandemic changed migrants' perceptions of moving to, staying in small and mid-sized cities or regional areas? Has it influenced how local governments or communities are approaching migrant attraction and retention now? And she put as an example, remote work opportunities.
Talia, you go.
Thanks, Martina. I think it's been an interesting journey with the pandemic. In the very early days, we started to see here, I guess, a bit of a fear of the outsider. So a lot of smaller communities who before had been quite proactive in trying to attract new residents suddenly didn't want to be part of different initiatives anymore. And there was the fear that came into that. But as the pandemic has evolved, I think, and especially in the situation of Australia and many countries around the world with the borders closing, there's been such a huge demand for labour in regional areas, and that's really influenced a total turnaround from regional communities now, where we're starting to see this almost forming a catalyst for a lot of these conversations happening at a local level around the importance of migration. And if anything, I've seen the pandemic really accelerate these conversations around the benefits migrants bring, and towns really starting to think through and plan for how they can compete against the other places that are also in desperate need of workers currently. So that's been a really great thing in terms of building that broad community buy-in around migrant attraction, and I guess that investment and participation in the welcome piece. But at the same time, there's been other challenges that many countries, I know Canada, face a similar thing around the impact of people relocating from cities into regional areas, and what that's done to the cost of living and the price of housing. So a lot of the draw cards that regional communities previously had are not quite as shiny as they used to be. So that will be an ongoing challenge that needs attention.
Maybe just add to that, and yeah, everything that Talia has just said also came out from conversations we've recently had in regional areas in Victoria. Maybe one point that also has emerged a lot more pertinently is to do with that lack of labour, of mobile labour, is the presence of undocumented migrants in the regions. And it's very obvious that everyone knows about their presence. They're an important part of the horticulture labour market, and everyone turns a blind eye because they're so much part of the kind of local economy. So in a way, the pandemic has really, with everyone being aware of the lacking labour, and that also actually relates to skilled migrants. So there's no skilled migrants or hardly any skilled visa holders coming into the region now. So I think it has just made more obvious how much regional economies depend on mobile labour, and also all the flaws and weaknesses and problems in these regional labour markets.
Thanks. Yolande?
Yeah, I was going to just take a little bit of a different angle and just think a little bit about the housing market, because I think that's where I see the pandemic having huge implications. Just in the Atlantic Canada case, the trend of counter urbanization, or however you want to call it, of people who were escaping the pandemic from, escaping the larger centers like Toronto, people who are retiring to Atlantic Canada, buying homes, and then people in Atlantic Canada who are seeing that opportunity and choosing to sell, meaning they are, potentially evicting their current tenants to take advantage of that flow. I mean, we've been doing some research on the housing market in Newfoundland and Labrador, and really finding that people, this has kind of made a housing crisis for people living here, immigrants and temporary workers who, have faced, in some cases, eviction, have faced rising costs because of the need to have better Wi-Fi or better supports for working from home. On one hand, it's been like a really big challenge, but on the other hand, in the housing market, we also found some evidence of immigrants who were able to buy homes themselves during this period because of access to CERC, for example, which enabled them to have more financial resources. So I think the housing market is sort of a key dimension here, and it's really understudied when it comes to small and medium-sized cities.
Great, thank you. So I will ask you each a different question now. So Martina, could you speak more about your work on multi-local settlement and the inability of policies to appreciate that people need different things at different moments in their lives, and that their settlement may involve mobility between small and larger urban centers? How could this be integrated in policy? And this is coming from Anna, but I had the same question, so look forward to your answer.
Thanks, Anna. It's a great question that I can't fully answer, but so I can speak to the part of the multi-local settlement. So in our research on where we try to understand what are the connections between migrants' moves to regional Australia and the employment pathways, underpinned by the idea that people always try to improve their opportunities, and very often these are employment related, we found that most of the migrants who reside in regional Australia have actually already moved a few times within Australia, in addition to the pre-arrival moves. And these were very often employment oriented up to a certain point. And then there's the point where, of course, other family members' needs come into the equation. And I mean, this also relates to another conversation that's happening in the chat on the restrictions on mobility. So a lot of the people we spoke to did actually stay because a partner, and it wasn't always the male partners, it was sometimes the female partner who had to stay in the location because their job was there. And of course, the secondary applicant could have moved somewhere else with the children, but they tend not to do that. And they tend to hold their career and look more after the children because there's no family support. So there's all kinds of compromises that are made within families because of this tie to an employer. And this is just a skilled migrant population. There's also the low-skilled labour migrants that are tied to employers, such as the Pacific labourers, so the Pacific seasonal workers, for example. So the regulations of having to stay in one place put a hold on people's life plans for a while, and then a whole family plans. So how can local governments do something about it? So I think one part of that is really setting expectations right. So we know that refugee arrivals, the permanent residents, they can move wherever, they're free to move. And we know again and again, we find out about families who move once the children are ready for higher education. So they move for better educational opportunities. They move first to the regional location because they want a quieter lifestyle and a safer lifestyle for the children, and then they move away again to go back to the city for higher education. So even to set the expectation in communities that refugee families might come with young children and then move on. Then another part in relation to the skilled migrants, to put really more investment into supporting employment pathways of secondary applicants. So to not accept that it's just the skilled migrant, the primary applicant who we need, but these people come with families. So if we want them to stay, then it's worth investing into them as a family. And there was a fantastic initiative a few years ago in Victoria, the Regional Skilled Migration Coordinators. There was a network of coordinators that actually liaised between the skilled migrant arrivals and the employer, and also looked after the whole family needs and helped with employment, so finding employment for partners, help with linking the children in with care institutions. So it's these links, and they may well be placed at the local level, that need to be invested in if retention is really the aim. So it's not good enough to just think about the skills that are matched, but we need to think of these people as coming with families, coming with also trans-local connections. So some people will never stay because the real center is in another town, and that's okay. So there's just many regional community members that have invested a lot into welcoming people, hoping and trusting that they will stay, and are then terribly disappointed. So to get the story right and to say, well, some people might be here for a life stage, and that's okay, we still help them, and then they move on, is the first point, I think, that we need to communicate. So rather than presenting that pictures, regional migration is the answer to population issues, labour shortages, and people will just stay because one person in the family has a job. Sorry, I hope I haven't spoken to that.
Thanks, Martina. I had a follow-up question to that. I think that's a really interesting perspective that deserves more attention. But how can we balance that with the need that communities have or perceive that they have to attract and retain migrants? What would you say to communities if you were to implement policy that somehow embraced the mobility of migrants over the life course? I know it's a difficult question.
It's a difficult question, but it's also, I have to say, we probably might misrepresent regional towns if we think of them as places that have always been stable and the same. And everyone who looks a bit into regional towns emphasizes this, that we often have a history of mobility, well, out of kind of locally born people to the city, return migration, mobile seasonal labor. So very often these locations are actually used to mobility, and it's almost that this more recent narrative of attracting and retention is very much in contradiction to these histories that we know of, beside the fact that there's also you know, Aboriginal people's movement and mobility there too. But I think there's a misrepresentation of what regional towns are about, and people, human geographers have written about this, the multicultural, multifunctional countryside. So this is not actually an all new phenomenon. It is rather that certain visas and certain narratives about attraction and retention, I think they are the problem. So I think we need to change this narrative.
Thank you very much. Okay, so going over to Yolande, it's a somewhat related question. In your findings with regard to the connections between higher education and entrepreneurship and staying, did you investigate the role of life stages? You seem to suggest that aspiring gateways can be attractive even for young and single people. So I, and this is Anna, was wondering, in the success cases, what are our insights about what made those work?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We didn't look explicitly at life stage. I think the international startup phenomenon that we found in St. John's is one that's directly tied to incubators and specifically tied to the university's incubator. And I think what's really notable is that case. So they're, you know, fresh grads, if you will, coming out of incubator programs, but the programs themselves have really transformed in recent years. We asked participants, you know, how has this changed? And they said things like, you know, a few years ago, there was no immigrant lens to this. this was, these were programs targeted to Canadians that necessarily were not mindful of kind of what are the rules and restrictions around who can hold, who can hold the patent and how this can be arranged, and that those incubators have really shifted, at least the one, we studied, have shifted towards being more aware of international student experiences and migrant student experiences, I will say. So, I think the key thing is Nelson Graham. I'll just kind of also mention that he did other research with entrepreneurs in St. John's who weren't connected to the university, who were starting businesses that were not necessarily, we wouldn't necessarily call them like tech startups. And he found that those people had really fewer resources when they weren't connected to the university. It was much more of a struggle. And so the kind of like the cultural support system around that ecosystem is not as robust as it is around the university. Another thing we found, housing affordability was a major thing for people, for entrepreneurs kind of success. But I also want to flag that some of the people we interviewed had kind of returned to school, had kind of come to Canada through different visa channels, tried to work in the wage labor market and then been excluded from the wage labor market, and had returned to university and then become entrepreneurs. So actually kind of, I think like the success storyline and the age and life stage also has to be tempered by the fact that, many entrepreneurs in Canada who are immigrants arrive at entrepreneurship as a result of exclusion from the wage labor market. But the last point I'll say on this is that we also found that there were people that had come to study at Memorial University kind of years ago as international students, had spent time working in other fields, and then had arrived and become entrepreneurs much later. So just suggesting and making the point that like who is an entrepreneur? It's not only people that come through entrepreneurial channels and are selected as entrepreneurs. It's really much more diverse than that. And I think we need to acknowledge that more.
Thanks, Yolande. And Talia, I guess this will be the last question. We're rapidly running out of time. This is from Elka. While many factors influence migrant attraction and retention, often the bottom line is still employment opportunities and integration, and smaller communities that have only seasonal employment are bound to suffer. What do you think are the solutions?
Yeah, thank you. It's a good question, and it's a challenge facing many communities. I think it's all about finding the right fit. So if we can, and if small and mid-sized cities can get clear on what it is they have to offer and help people make informed decisions about relocating to their community based on that offering, then supporting that decision-making process for the prospective new resident is part of the process that they've gone through to understand what may be the trade-offs if I move to this community. So I spoke to, as an example, the Eritrean new resident in the rural community of Orde in Sweden that I showed on the video. He was a professional before coming to Sweden and had actively made a decision that the majority of work available in that community was in the ski fields industry, and also they had a summer tourism sector, so very, very seasonal. But he talked to me through about the fact that he'd made a decision that although it was probably going to be difficult for him to get a job in his chosen profession, that the fact he'd found himself and his wife and his children in a community where he felt a really strong connection to the place. He'd formed really good friendships with his neighbours. That overrode the fact that he wasn't likely to get a job in his chosen profession. So it's about supporting migrants to think through the decision-making process and make an informed decision about where they're going, because it's not going to be for everyone. And I think that's some of the challenges they found in Missoula, Montana, for instance, where a lot of the jobs there are also in the service sector. it's been very difficult for people to gain employment in more skilled professions. They have seen people move on, resettled refugees move on to other communities. And going back to Martina's comment around community expectations, I think that's a really important part that we need to factor into these types of planning processes and approaches, that we need to support community members from very early on to understand that at the end of the day, if we can support people to make choices that are right for them and their family, then and help to find the right fit between the skills and the aspirations and hopes of the migrant and their family and what that regional community has to offer, then that's where it's going to be win-win for the host community and the newcomer alike.
Great. Thank you, Talia. I'm afraid on that note, we're going to have to wrap up. I feel that we could go on for much longer. But I would like to thank our speakers once again for their thought-provoking presentations. It was wonderful to have perspectives from different parts of the world. I also really appreciated how the three presentations were complementary, and they looked at the issue of migration to small and mid-sized cities from different perspectives and offered a range of theoretical and practical insights. Thank you also to everyone who participated in this session for your excellent questions and your engagement with this important topic. I apologize if we couldn't get through all of the questions. The chat box was quite lively, but I do hope that we'll have more opportunities to meet and continue the conversation in the future. I'm also happy to report that the conference isn't quite over yet, and I would encourage you all to join us again tomorrow at the same Zoom link for the final session of the conference, which is entitled Suburban Migration, Interrogating the Intersections of Global Migration and Suburban Transformation. Note that the session will start at 9:30 a.m. Eastern Time. So with that, I wish you all a good day or a good night, depending on where you are in the world, and goodbye for now.